Jake clenched the worn beret in his hands, once part of his military uniform. An old jacket with faded patches hung from his shoulder, the only thing left from his past life. He stood before the door of a small cafe in the city center, hesitating whether to enter. His shoes were covered in dust, and his pants were slightly torn at the knees. Jake finally gathered his strength and walked in. The air was filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods. Inside it was crowded, young office workers with laptops, students with textbooks, a few couples speaking softly to each other. Jake felt the weight of their stares. Some looked away, but he caught glimpses of surprise and disapproval in their eyes. He approached the counter. Behind it stood a young waitress with a name tag that read Megan. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her hair tied into a messy bun. "Hello. What would you like to order?" she asked in a neutral but slightly tense voice. "A cup of coffee and a sandwich, please," Jake said, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. Megan glanced at his clothes, the worn jacket, the scratches on his hands. Her gaze turned cold. She inhaled sharply. "Sorry, but I think you should leave." Jake froze, not believing his ears. "What?" He tried to smile, thinking he might have misheard. "You can't stay here," she said more firmly. "We have a policy regarding the appearance of our customers." Jake felt his blood rush to his face. His voice trembled. "So because I look bad, I can't have a cup of coffee?" Megan sighed, casting a quick glance at the manager standing by the entrance to the kitchen. He was watching them with raised eyebrows, as if waiting to see how she would handle the situation. "I'm just following the rules," she said, but her voice now sounded less certain. Jake took a step closer, his voice firm. "I served this country. I protected people like you. And now I'm being refused a cup of coffee because I don't look presentable." A few customers at nearby tables turned their heads, listening in. Megan nervously gripped the tray. I'm really sorry," she mumbled. "If you're sorry, just bring me the coffee," Jake snapped. His eyes flashed with anger, but his voice remained steady. Megan froze for a second. She glanced at the manager, who merely shrugged, signaling that she would have to resolve it herself. "Please leave the cafe," she finally said, her voice breaking on the last word. Jake clenched his jaw, his hands trembling. He took a deep breath to calm himself. "You know what? Forget it," he hissed and turned to leave. He could feel their eyes on him. His heart raced in his chest, and thoughts swirled in his mind. Is this really who I've become now? The kind of person they can just throw out? Jake pushed the door open with force, and it slammed shut behind him. He stepped onto the sidewalk, where the cool wind immediately hit his face. His hands trembled with anger. He raised the collar of his jacket and slowly walked towards the old bench by the bus stop. He sat down, leaning his elbows on his knees, and covered his face with his hands. His heart pounded, and fragments of the past spun in his mind. Sandstorms, the whistling of bullets, the cries of his comrades. And now, a refusal of a cup of coffee. His chest tightened with humiliation. Rough day. Jake looked up and saw a tall man in a long dark coat standing before him. It was Denzel Washington. His identity was unmistakable. He held 2 cardboard cups of coffee. "What do you want?" Jake asked curtly. Denzel sat next to him and handed him one of the cups. "Thought you might appreciate a hot cup of coffee," he said in a calm voice. Jake paused for a moment, then slowly took the cup. "Thanks." "But why?" Denzel shrugged. "You look like you could use someone to sit with." Jake snorted. "Yeah, I look like the kind of person who just needs to sit with someone and drink coffee. You know, I've seen a lot of people like you." Denzel took a sip of his coffee. Veterans who have to fight not just on the battlefield, but at home. Jake tensed. "And you think it's your mission to help me?" Denzel smiled. "No, but I know what it's like to feel like you're out of place in a world you once fought for." Jake took a deep breath and sipped the hot coffee. It burned his tongue a little, but he didn't mind. In that cafe, They just looked at me like I was trash. He sighed. I'm used to it, but today it was too much. Denzel nodded. People fear what they don't understand. They see the scars on you, physical or emotional, and it makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather look away than ask what happened. Jake let out a bitter laugh. You talk like you know exactly what that feels like. Denzel went silent for a moment, his expression turning serious. I know more than you think, he said quietly. And I know that what happened today doesn't define you. Jake looked at him. Then what does define me? Denzel leaned in closer. How you get up after this. How you move forward, even when the world seems unfair. Jake was silent. He felt the anger that had been boiling inside him slowly subside. He looked at the cup of coffee in his hands and slowly nodded. You know, maybe you're right, he said quietly. I know I am, Denzel replied with a slight smile. He stood up and patted Jake on the shoulder. Let's go. I know a place that serves the best sandwich in town. And don't worry, they don't judge customers by their appearance. Jake stood up. For the first time in a long while, he felt like someone actually cared. All right, he said. Just make sure it's a turkey sandwich. Denzel laughed. We'll decide on the way. Jake and Denzel walked along the sidewalk, silent for a while. The air was cool, and their footsteps echoed in the quiet of the evening city. Jake could feel the tension inside him slowly fading. The coffee in his hand was still warm, and this simple gesture, someone caring about him, warmed him more than the drink. So, Jake began, glancing at Denzel from the corner of his eye. Why are you doing this? Helping people like me. Denzel smiled slightly, but his gaze became serious. I know what it's like to be at the bottom, to feel like you're indebted to someone, but get nothing in return. Jake squinted. Did you fight? Denzel nodded. Not like you, but I've seen a lot. And lost a lot too. His voice darkened, and for a moment, a shadow of pain flashed in his eyes. So when I see someone fighting their demons, I know how hard it is. And sometimes, all you need is for someone to just sit next to you and offer you a cup of coffee. Jake inhaled the cold air. Do you think this will ever go away? This feeling of emptiness. Denzel stopped, and Jake did the same. Denzel looked at him intently. No, but you'll learn to live with it. The emptiness will remain, but you'll find other things to fill it. People, moments, things that matter. Jake sighed and rubbed his face with his hands. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Denzel smiled. No one is ready. But one day, you'll just wake up and realize that the burden doesn't feel so heavy anymore. They continued walking. Denzel led Jake down a quiet street where the streetlights cast soft light on the sidewalk. A small cafe with a red neon sign flickered at the end of the street. This is where they serve the turkey sandwich I told you about, Denzel said, stopping by the door. Jake shrugged. All right. It can't be worse than the place that turned me down for coffee. Denzel laughed. They entered. The small cafe was almost empty. Some people sat at tables, a few were working on laptops, and an old waiter was wiping down the bar counter. The air smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Sit down, guys. I'll be right there. The waiter nodded without looking at them. Now that's what I call service, Jake smiled. They sat at a table by the window. Denzel took off his coat and draped it over the back of his chair. So, how long have you been back home? Denzel asked, watching Jake take off his jacket. About 5 years, Jake replied, rubbing his hands. But sometimes it feels like I'm still there. Because part of you really is still there, Denzel said quietly. Jake looked at him. How do you stop that? Denzel leaned back in his chair. I don't think you can stop it. But you can learn to move forward. Instead of drowning in memories, you can use them. Jake raised an eyebrow skeptically. And how am I supposed to do that? Denzel paused for a moment. Start simple. Help someone else. Support someone who's in the same situation you were. And one day, you'll realize that your experience isn't just a burden, but also a tool to change someone's life. Jake smiled. Sounds like your life philosophy? Call it whatever you want, Denzel replied with a slight smile. But I know it works. The waiter approached and placed 2 plates with sandwiches in front of them. On me, he said and walked away. Jake looked at the sandwich and then at Denzel. All right, maybe I'm not ready to help others yet, but trying this sandwich. That's a start, right? Denzel laughed. Absolutely. They ate in silence. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt calm. His thoughts were no longer swirling in a whirlwind of memories. There was someone sitting next to him who understood him. It was a new feeling, and he liked it. So, Denzel said, finishing his coffee, another sandwich? Jake smiled. Of course. But this time with chicken. Denzel raised his hand, catching the waiter's attention. And Jake paused for a moment. Thank you. Denzel nodded. Always happy to help. An hour later, they left the cafe and slowly walked down the street. Jake felt a pleasant tiredness, whether from the food or the conversation, which for the first time in a long while made him feel normal. So what's next? Denzel asked, hands shoved in the pockets of his coat. Jake shrugged. I don't know. I'll go back to my motel, lie down on the bed, and probably just stare at the ceiling, thinking about all my mistakes. Not the best plan, Denzel replied with a smile. Well, if you have a better suggestion, I'm all ears. Denzel paused for a moment. I have an idea. And what's that? Denzel stopped and looked at Jake. Tomorrow at 7 in the morning, by the old stadium. The stadium. I work there sometimes. Maybe you should try something new. Jake squinted skeptically. Physical labor isn't exactly what I need. Maybe it's exactly what you need, Denzel said. Jake sighed, considering the offer. All right, he said finally. But if this turns out to be another stupid idea, I'm out. Fair deal, Denzel nodded. They parted ways at the corner of the street. Jake watched as Denzel disappeared into the darkness, then headed towards his motel. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of the alarm clock. It was 6 a.m. He stretched out his arm to turn it off and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Damn, what am I doing? He muttered as he sat up on the bed. After a quick shower and a cup of instant coffee, he threw on an old sweater and jeans and headed for the stadium. The cold air cut through him to the bone. When he arrived at the stadium, Denzel was already waiting for him by the gates. He was dressed in a sports jacket and held a pair of work gloves in his hands. I thought you wouldn't show up, Denzel said with a smile. I thought the same, Jake replied. Ready to work? Let's see what you have in store for me. They entered the stadium grounds. The field was empty, and the stands were covered with a thin layer of frost. By the utility building, there were old benches and a pile of broken chairs. Do we need to clean all this up? Jake asked, surprised. No, just half of it, Denzel winked. Very funny. Denzel handed him the gloves. Let's start small. Jake sighed, put on the gloves, and got to work. They worked in silence. Jake gathered pieces of wood and metal, piling them up, while Denzel dragged old benches to the service entrance. After an hour, Jake was breathing heavily, but he felt a strange sense of relief. Movement helped. The work gave him a feeling of control. Not bad for a rookie, Denzel said, glancing at the neat row of benches by the exit. I'm still alive, Jake mumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. Denzel nodded towards a plastic container of water. Break. They sat on the edge of the stands, drinking water. Jake looked out at the empty field in front of him. This is your place, huh? What do you mean? You feel at home here. Denzel smiled slightly. Maybe. Jake nodded silently. He felt that strange calm again, like the night before. Why are you doing this? Jake asked. What exactly? Helping me. Denzel took a sip of water. Because someone helped me once. And I know how important it is to have someone who won't let you fall completely. Jake looked at him. And did it work? Denzel smiled. I'm here, aren't I? Jake smiled in response. Suddenly, a few teenagers ran onto the field with a ball. They started kicking it around the grass, laughing loudly and shouting at each other. One of them missed, and the ball rolled over to the bench where Jake and Denzel were sitting. "Hey, mister, toss it," one of the boys shouted. Jake picked up the ball and tossed it back. The boy caught it and gave a thumbs up. "Thanks." Jake looked at them and thought for a moment. "They don't even know how easy that is for them," he muttered. Denzel looked at him. "That's fine. They don't need to know." Jake took a deep breath of the cold air. "Maybe." Denzel stood up and extended his hand to Jake. "More work." Jake looked at the pile of debris near the field and grimaced. "If I die from exhaustion, you owe me a beer." Denzel laughed. "Deal." Jake grabbed his hand and got up. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was moving forward. The next morning, Jake woke up earlier than he had planned. He lay in bed for a few more minutes, staring at the cracked ceiling of the motel, then abruptly got up. The events of the previous day were still on his mind. Denzel was right. Working had given him some strange sense of control. He hadn't felt that in a long time. Jake got dressed, quickly drank a cup of instant coffee, and headed to the stadium. The dawn sun was breaking through the cold morning mist. When he reached the stadium gates, Denzel was already waiting for him, just like yesterday, with the same smile on his face. "You came back," Denzel said, tossing him a pair of work gloves. "You look surprised." "I am a little surprised." Jake put on the gloves and looked at the pile of benches by the field. "What are we doing today?" "You'll see," Denzel replied. They started working together again. Denzel taught Jake how to properly attach boards to metal frames and paint over the rusty parts. The work was physically demanding, but Jake felt some hidden meaning in it. His body was working, and his mind was resting. "Do you always work like this?" Jake asked during a short break. "Mostly," Denzel replied, wiping his hands with a rag. "I help clean up this place. Someone has to do it." Jake nodded. "And do they pay you for this?" Denzel laughed. "No, this is just for myself." "Why?" Denzel thought for a moment. "Because this place saved me once." Jake raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Tell me." Denzel tilted his head, looking at the field. "It was a long time ago. I was at rock bottom. Lost everything, my job, friends, almost a roof over my head. I decided life owed me nothing anymore." "And what changed?" Denzel sighed. "I came here. Just sat on a bench, like you did that day. One of the local coaches saw me and offered to help paint the stands. I agreed I didn't care. But you know what? It worked. I started feeling useful. And slowly, things in my life started to fall into place." Jake was silent. His gaze wandered over the stands, where some boys were kicking a ball around. "And you think this will work for me too?" Denzel looked at him. "It's already working." Jake gave a crooked smile. "Maybe you're right." Suddenly, they heard shouting from the stands. Jake and Denzel turned around. One of the boys was lying on the ground, clutching his knee. The other teenagers gathered around him. "We've got a problem," Denzel said, heading toward the boys. Jake hesitated for a second, then followed him. "What happened?" Denzel asked, kneeling next to the boy. "He twisted his ankle," one of the friends said. Denzel carefully examined the boy's knee. "It's not broken, but it looks bad. You need to ice it." "There's a first aid kit in the storage room," Jake said, not waiting for a response. He ran to the technical building. A minute later, he returned with the first aid kit and a bag of ice. Denzel carefully pressed the ice against the boy's knee. "Here," he said, handing the bag to one of the boy's friends. "Thanks, mister," the boy whispered. "What's your name?" Denzel asked. "Nick," the boy replied. "It'll be fine, Nick," Denzel smiled. "Just rest for a bit." The boy nodded, and his friends helped him get up. "Good job," Denzel said, turning back to Jake. "You handled it well," Jake replied. "But without you, I wouldn't have had the ice." "Okay, I'll take that," Jake smiled. They returned to the benches. Jake felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had done something good. For the first time in a long time, he felt like part of something bigger than just his own life. Well then, Denzel said, turning back to the pile of boards. Shall we get back to work? Jake sighed, but inside he felt an inexplicable sense of relief. Let's get back to it. They got back to work. The sun rose higher, and the stadium came to life. Jake worked, and this time he knew it made sense.